So just to recap where we're at. Arjuna has just had a dilemma, a high-stakes dilemma, where either option is a problem. That's what dilemma is. It's where you have a choice between two options, and both options are seriously problematic. Arjuna's dilemma is the most severe you can think of. It's either let all of the people he's responsible for suffer, or fight against the people he respects the most. And Bhishma, Arjuna's grandfather, was Arjun's father functionally. He raised Arjuna because his biological father was killed when he was very, very young. So he was raised by Bhishma. So for all intents and purposes, we can say that Bhishma was Arjuna's father. Additionally, Drona was his guru. These two figures in the patriarchal Vedic society, especially amongst the warrior class, especially in a wartime situation, you would never fight against your mother. That just wouldn't happen. So this represented everything Arjuna held dear. And although the idea of killing your family members is unthinkable in the West, it's even more unthinkable the further back you go in time, when family values were the most important thing to people. And specifically in India, even today, family is so unbelievably important. And then when you go back in time, so it's not only time-wise, but just geographically, we're in a place in the world where family is everything. And then you're going back thousands of years in time to where you'd rather die 1,000 deaths than disobey your parents. And somehow Arjuna wound up in this circumstance. And Krishna gave him two pieces of advice which ignored almost all of Arjuna's deliberations. Arjuna himself was trying to figure it out, and he couldn't figure it out. And he came to Krishna, and Krishna more or less ignored his entire train of thought and gave him two things. One of them was cognitive, that you're not the body, you are a soul. And the other one was behavioral, that once you realize you're the body and not the soul, you should attach yourself not to your body, but to your duty. Now, once you realize you're the soul and not the body, you're not the body, you're the soul, then you should, in light of that fact, you should then attach yourself to your duty instead of attaching yourself to your body and its evolutes in the form of your children and your family and your friends. It's a radical idea. Normally we glorify people who are attached to their family as being just the greatest thing ever. But I think there are exceptions to that. If you look at politics and politicians, there is a general sense in which politicians have to. It's one of the reasons why men are, there's way more male politicians than female politicians, because there's a real sense in which you put your family second and your constituency first. And you serve the will of the people. And so that's, at least in traditional society, that's almost impossible to do because the women are lactating and making children. But even in today's society, women are the ones who get pregnant. We can't reverse that. They're also the ones who lactate if you want to breastfeed. And so it puts them in a position where they are more likely to, more skilled at child rearing, especially in the early days of infancy. And they're almost penalized for getting involved in public service and things like that because they have it's a 9-month shackle in the form of pregnancy, maybe another 6 months to get their act together, postpartum, so at least a year and a half. And if you add breastfeeding in the equation, it's more like 2 or 3 years. And although there are ways around that, you can have a homemaker who's a father, You can opt for formula. You can express the milk. There's lots of things you can do to work around it, but that doesn't change the biological reality that carrying a child it's a serious physical challenge and burden. It's not that now of course men go off to war, which is why 99.9% of people who die in wars over the last 5,000 years have been male. But you know, so it's not that men don't have the challenge. 94% of workplace-related deaths are men. 78% of suicides are men. That's really concerning. That's a strange statistic. It's unusual. And so it's not that, you know, being a male doesn't carry with it its own challenges. So anyway, so for Arjun, he was in this patriarchal warrior society. He was having to fight. He had to defend people, put his life in harm's way, and he was going to have to kill his family or be killed by them and actually fight his father and his teacher. And for him, that would have been the most unthinkable, disturbing thing. There's practically nothing that's worse than that, save and except for letting everyone who depends on him suffer. This is a real dilemma. And Krishna responded to that: attach yourself to your duty. And normally we would think your family is your greatest duty. I don't know if we actually think that way. You'd have to think it through, right? If you could prevent the Twin Towers from coming down, but your child would die, you either could save your child. It's normal. It's like kind of what happens in movies, right? There's like this either or situation. So your child dies, or you let the Twin Towers come down, 3,000 people die. Which is the right choice? I don't think it's just, you know, yes, save your child, let 3,000 people die, who are also people's children. Mothers, fathers, children. I don't think it's as simple as that. I think this debate between your duty to the greater society and then your duty to your family, and these things come in conflict in somebody's life, and you have to resolve them, I don't think it's that unusual that people don't encounter some version of this in their life, of their values, their duty, and their family. I mean, certainly we can look at the modern day warrior class. We have a member of the modern day warrior class in our midst, two members if you can include Howard, who's an ex-cop, ex-LA cop, but definitely one. But, you know, in the form of Narayan, but Narayan had deployed several times. He went, you know, downrange. He was in theater in a situation where he could have died in the Middle East, in a conflict zone, where he served multiple tours of duty, spent some years of his life, and that put him in a situation where he had to leave his family. And that's what you sign up for. So every member of the military in the U.S., however many millions of, I don't know what we got, a million-man army or what we got, I know they have that in China, but I don't know what we have here. But every member of the military is potentially going to be forced to leave their family to do their duty. And when police officers go to work, it might be a 9-to-5 job, so they're not leaving to go to the Middle East, but they are. Interestingly, there was at our LA temple, a girl was just outside the Brahmachari ashram, and two men approached her with a gun and said, give us your keys. And she said no. And then they pistol whipped her, hit her with the gun, knocked her out, and took the car. And then the police, she left her cell phone in the car, and so they were able to track the car based on the cell phone, and they tracked it to a house in Compton. And according to the police, they said, we're not going to go in the house because we're not going to risk our lives for a cell phone. We're only going to go into this place for a murder. not for a cell phone. I don't know if they actually said that, but that's what, according to the girl, that's what they told her. I said contact the news, call out the cowardice of the police. But it's not really a cell phone. You're going in there to protect a woman who suffered assault and battery by people who are ostensibly going to do it again, especially if you don't check them and you know where they are. I was surprised to find out that the police are so cowardly in Los Angeles. I knew that there's certain places, where Chicago, certain parts of Chicago, where it's actually a war zone. Definitely if you cross the border, it gets into that pretty quick, just right there in TJ. But I was surprised to find out that in LA, the police were so cowardly that they wouldn't investigate and apprehend suspects in an assault and battery against a nun. I encouraged her to contact the media about it, if it was actually true. I couldn't believe it was true initially, and so I asked several times, and they kept going back and getting me reports. Yeah, that's exactly what was said. So if that's the case, it shows an incredible degree of cowardice on the part of the police. But there's this idea that when you strap on your gun, put your belt on, and go out, there's a possibility you might not come home. Your job involves carrying a weapon and getting in harm's way. So even today, it's not that difficult to think about where people come in conflict with their family responsibilities and their duty, and where your duty sometimes takes precedence. And you especially see this playing out in the military class, because that's where there's a stated potential for dying in the line of duty. Of course, you could die carpooling to work, or commuting to work. And there's all sorts of ways in which you can die, slipping in the bathtub, getting ready for work. So there's all sorts of work-related type injuries you can have, especially depending on the field you're in. But even today, in 2022, there's this in the line of duty, which means your duty takes precedence over your family, and you're risking your life as part of your job because of some ostensibly higher calling, because they don't pay you that much money, to protect and serve, and that might involve you dying and not coming home to your family, and they have to live without you because you died in the line of duty. And it's stated, it's on the job contract, so to speak. So we still have that. Then I think most of us who are not in the military, we have lesser versions of this conflict, but it does come up. The easiest version of this is getting involved in a bad romance and rejecting your family and friends to pursue a bad romance with somebody who's going to take you away from your family, who's against your family, who gets in the way of your relationship with your family, and whether it's because they're narcissistic, or whether it's just because they're not your family's first choice or something like that. Whatever it might be, they have issues. Whatever it is, it might just be the family doesn't approve of the person you're marrying, with their race, their background. Who knows? Just depends on the specific family. Certainly, I don't think racism is dead in the U.S. I don't think that doesn't. We might not want to say it. It's taboo to say it, but I certainly think that factors into some people's decisions about who they want their kids to marry, who's appropriate to marry. But yeah, when people get involved in a romance and they reject their family and friends and their duties and even their job, and they just go head over heels into their relationship, and it becomes all about that other person, and they take all of their responsibilities and throw them by the wayside. I mean, that's pretty common. I think that would be a variation of duty over family. Family here being romance, and duty being your duty to your family or friends or job or community, whatever it might be. I also think sometimes in a family there are going to be value conflicts. And sometimes you have to, it's interesting, but alpha males, which is a term that doesn't really apply to human beings because we don't live in a pack with an alpha couple. And when they did have alpha couples, like studied wolves, and to a large extent wolves, they study wolves in captivity, but it doesn't really work. But wolves in the wild, the alpha couple is generally speaking the mother and father, and then the subordinates, the betas and gammas and omegas, are their children. So it's really just a nuclear family with the mom and dad at the top of the food chain. But there are alpha situations, even with primates you see it. And the alpha male, and the idea of like having like a community, like a masculinist community of alpha males doesn't work because the very nature of the alpha is there's only one of them. So there would have to be just one alpha. But if you have a community of alphas and they're a community of men, then by that very definition, they've all become betas because they're working as a community instead of as the top dog. Does that make sense? But anyway, the alpha is not always the biggest, fastest, strongest, fiercest, most violent. Rather, the alpha is the most selfless in the pack. And so things alphas do is they play with children. Even though amongst male primates, they're not really concerned about the children. That's left to the females. But the alphas will play with children, tickle children, because it gets them in there with the females. They'll share food. They don't eat first. They share food, and when they resolve conflicts. And one of the ways they resolve conflicts is they almost always take the side of the underdog in the conflict. So if there's a weaker member of the tribe who has a conflict with a stronger member of the tribe, which would normally result in a fight, and they would lose that fight, the alpha will step in on behalf of the underdog, even going against his own family members. So the alpha is characterized by sharing food, by lifting up the more downtrodden members of the community, by keeping the peace, and by having strong strategic liaisons with the whole community such that he's able to stay in power. Bonobos have alpha females, interestingly enough, and they lead the pack. And they, along with chimpanzees, most closely resemble human beings in terms of genes. In terms of DNA. So this idea is there. You have to think about it a little creatively to think how it manifests in your life. But what happens when your values conflict with the values of your family? What happens when your need to keep the peace conflicts with, your children's desires? What happens when doing right by your community conflicts with the desires of your family members? What happens when your romantic desires come into conflict with your community responsibilities? So I do think we see variations on the basic theme of duty versus desire, or duty versus family, or values versus friends. I do think this basic dilemma shows up in everyone's lives. It's a straight application if you're in the military. But even if you're not, I think if we think about it deeply enough, we'll see that Arjun's dilemma is the basic dilemma of our adult life. I don't think this manifests as a child. This happens when you reach adulthood and you're able to make decisions and decide how you want to play it and what's the greater good and so on and so forth. It manifests in young adulthood. Let's say, during puberty and beyond. What are my values? What are my family's values? Those are in conflict. What about my romantic interests? How does that interface with my family's interests? And I have to resolve that. my plans for the future versus my family's plans for the future. Their needs versus my desires. Their needs versus my needs. Their needs versus my wants. Their wants versus my wants. My needs versus their wants. It's like every variation of it. But there's a theme on one side, a greater duty, a greater responsibility is on one side, and then a more nucleic, a more nuclear, centered around the family unit, a smaller, form around a nucleus, smaller responsibility. What do you guys think about that? Have you ever thought about that before? Raise your hand if you thought about that before. Because I never thought about that before. So maybe you guys should be giving class. So let me get this straight. You've thought in the Gita, I'm asking two of you, you read the Gita and thought, wow, Arjun's dilemma between duty and family manifests in everybody's lives on some level. You had that thought?
No, I've considered the conflict between duty.
Okay, yeah, that's obviously, we've all done that. I'm saying applying the teaching of the Gita and showing the broadness of the Gita's applicability. You haven't done that yet. I believe if you told me you had. You're born a devotee. I would believe you, Drew. But for me, I'm excited because I'm thinking, wow, look at this. This is really the stuff of life. This is what we all go through. Have you ever thought that Arjuna's dilemma mirrors you putting romantic interests above duty to your value system? Had you thought that before? It's an interesting point, isn't it? And Krishna's on the side of duty. Just FYI. The idea of putting romance above all else is just, it's almost like it doesn't even exist in like Indian philosophical writing. It's such a stupid thing to put romantic interests above responsibility to community and teachers and your duty. It's like it doesn't even like show up on the radar. It's like a Western kind of Romeo and Juliet type Shakespearean thing. It doesn't even make sense. You watch an Indian movie, you'll get a sense of this. Even today, I don't know what Indian movies are like today, but if you go back 20 years or something like that, and you look at Indian Bollywood movies, classic Bollywood movie would be, there's a guy and a girl, they fall in love. They're from the wrong caste. Family shuts it down. Previously, it would never even be a Muslim and a Hindu, but nowadays it's like a Muslim and a Hindu. They fall in love. Family says, no way. They don't marry. They don't have an affair. They don't marry. Hindu marries a Hindu, Muslim marries a Muslim, and they're bummed for their whole life. And then they die. There's a fire in the village, and the guy saves the village and dies in the fire. And that's it? Yes or no?
20 years.
Right? You see this, right? And you watch that as a Westerner, and you're like, is there a part two? This doesn't make any sense. This is a horrible movie. What's wrong with these people? It's like British humor. This self-deprecating, nauseating British humor just makes everybody squeamish. And it's almost like watching a horror movie. You just don't want to watch it after 5 minutes because it just gets worse and worse and darker and more disturbing. You guys know what I mean with British humor? It's the opposite of Latin humor. You watch it sometimes, you'll get totally disturbed. It's self-deprecating and disturbing and a little grotesque and disgusting and depressing, and it just gets worse as time goes on. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Yeah. And you're not even, you love it, but that's because you're a modern day goth, and so you get off on that stuff because you think it's somehow or other witty and alternative. And you're a super dark person, so It just allows you to indulge in your extreme negativity, and find socialization, social acceptability in your extreme negativity. British humor is just disturbing for most Americans. Like if you watch British Office, it just gets disturbing. It's not funny like the American version of Office. I mean, I watched the whole thing, but it's disturbing. It's like a horror movie. Like at various points, you're like, do I want to stop watching this? Like, I think I'm not enjoying this. Why am I watching this? I'm not enjoying this. An Indian movie has that effect on a person from the West. Because you're rooting for the guy and the girl to get together, and then they just don't. And they're miserable. And then they all die, and it's the end. It was a 4-hour movie to start with, so your mind is totally melted by the end of the movie anyway. And they have everything's a musical with massive dance sequences, and you're just like, why? Like, did they not get over the musical thing of the 50s? Like, you got to be kidding me! They're still doing musicals, and then every musical has 8 outfit changes in 10 minutes, and you're like, where is that? And there's a bunch of different settings too. They're in the water, and then they're up in the Alpines, and then they're out in the desert, and you're like, what does it mean? It doesn't even make sense. Do you know what I'm talking about? But there's just a totally different value system. That your duty to your family is first and foremost. I'm sure we'll eventually win over India through television and satellite dishes and, people being able to watch TV and raising their kids on TV, and we'll eventually win the day. America will win the day, and everyone will be a low-class American in due course of time. But this value and duty over family and desire is just such a big theme in Indian writing and Indian philosophical writing, even in Western philosophical writing, especially in ancient Greek society, Spartan society specifically, but even Athenian society as well. These are such big topics. Even in primatology, what's the benchmark of an alpha is this broader concept of duty that goes beyond just nepotism and self-interest. And that's really what's going on in the Gita. You're not the body. Don't be so attached to your body and its evolutes. Be more attached to your duty. That's something you can anchor yourself to. And although that idea sounds disturbing, archaic, ultra-spiritual, we get variations of this in life. And so in many ways, life itself creates some sort of a pre-theistic reality where you start to have to expand and go beyond yourself and your family and think about bigger topics and more important things and incorporate those things into your life decisions. And then as you start to think broader and broader, eventually you get to a line of demarcation. What's the line of demarcation in what I'm setting up?
Theism?
Yeah, theism. Is there a God? Am I a soul? Is there something which is the broadest, highest, longest, eternal truth? But you're warming up to that through the course of life, a progressive life, a life based on duty. It's pre-theistic because you're taking into account bigger ideas, bigger concepts, a bigger sense of self, a bigger sense of community, a bigger sense of responsibility. You're living your values, and it's broadening you. It's not narrowing you and making you more selfish and greedy. It's broadening you. And at some point, you get to that threshold, and you start to ask the really big questions. So Krishna merges those two things. He assumes spirituality very quickly. He argues for it. He doesn't assume it, but he establishes spirituality, argues for it, presents an argument for it, and assuming that the argument is successful, he then moves forward. And he moves forward that because you're a soul and not the body, therefore you shouldn't be so attached to the body, therefore you shouldn't be so attached to this world. You can't control for this world, you can control yourself. The argument actually works without theism. You can't control the goings and comings of the world or other people, you can only control yourself, therefore do your duty, live your values. That works even as an atheistic argument. It's strengthened by the idea that you are a soul, and therefore there's a bigger you to think about, a bigger reality to think about, the biggest reality to think about. It strengthens this duty-based ethic. But the duty-based ethic can be argued for even without any spirituality whatsoever. And so Arjuna has become convinced of this, and he asks Krishna. He says, text 54, Stita pragyasya kabhasha. What are the symptoms of the stita pragya, the person who's firm in their wisdom? Samadhi stasya keshava, of the one who is in samadhi. Sita di kim prabhasheta, of the one whose intellect, di is where you get the word dhyan from, it means your consciousness is firmly established. Stita means it's fixed. Stita di kim prabhasheta. How does that person speak? Kim asita. How do they sit? Asana. Same thing. Brajeta kim. How do they move? And so Arjuna asks 4 questions. What are the general symptoms of this self-realized soul? How do they speak? How do they sit? And how do they move? Krishna's answers will reveal that these questions were somewhat figurative and non-literal, in that how do they move doesn't literally mean how wide is their gait, and how do they sit doesn't literally mean do they sit in a chair or on the floor or cross-legged. So Krishna's answers will make clear that Arjuna's questions were, I don't want to say metaphorical, but I do want to say that they are non-literal questions. There is some philosophical content to what sounds like, maybe on one level, very specific questions about what kind of sitting posture. Do they walk or do they run? Do they speak loud or soft? Do they speak in complete sentences or aphorisms? That's not what Arjuna's asking, and Krishna's answers will make it clear what's being asked. But there's 4 questions at play. So the first question was about the general symptoms. Kabhasha. And Krishna responds, and he says, when a man gives up all varieties of desires for sense gratification, which arise from mental concoction, and when his mind thus purified finds satisfaction in the self alone, then he is said to be in pure transcendental consciousness. So, prajahati yada kaman sarvan partha manogatan. So, sarva kama, all desires, manogatan, which come from the mind. Prajahati, you've given them up. You've given up all the desires which come from your mind. What does your mind do? In Sanskrit, the mind is different from the intellect, and so different from the ego. And so what are the basic features of the mind? Anybody know? Like a serious Sankhya school, the mind has defining features. This is reflected in the yoga literature. The mind has specific features which distinguish it from the intellect. The mind is a very specific cognitive facet of what we would call the mind. We use the word mind for the whole noetic feature. We use the mind to represent the entire internal mental faculty. All of noetics is included within the mind. Everything. However, in Sankhya, the mind is parsed into various elements, one of which is mana, which we'll call mind, but we could call it something else, whatever you want it to. But the internal cognitive faculty is divided into various constituent elements. Just like we don't talk about the body, we talk about the heart and the lungs and the liver and the kidney and the stomach and the intestines and the large intestine and the small intestine. We have all these different features of your internal organs. Similarly, when looking at the internal cognitive aspect of a person, in Sanskrit, they divide mind into multiple features. Sometimes all those features are put together. You'll call it chitta. Sometimes even mana will be used for all the features, less so. There are terms for the whole cognitive faculty as a whole. Like I said, chitta is usually kind of commonly used in that regard. But mana, the mind, is usually something very specific in Sankhya literature. Yes, Dom.
If I remember correctly, it's sankalpa and vikalpa, which means accepting and rejecting.
Yeah, sankalpa, vikalpa, or rag and dvesh, attachment and aversion, desire and repulsion, attraction and repulsion. So either you now, and this gets into like the amygdala and the hippocampus, which is used for storing memories. That's used by the amygdala to light up under an MRI and register the desire for pleasure and the desire to avoid pain. We move towards pleasure and we move away from pain. This is the basic feature of all life. And at a certain degree of simplicity, animals will just automatically move towards pleasure and away from pain, and there is no cognition involved. Their brain structure, if you call it a brain, is simple enough. It's a coagulation of cells. And they'll move towards light, they'll move away from shadows. It just happens automatically. It becomes just like you breathe automatically and your heart rate adjusts automatically, so the animal will move automatically. You get this to some extent even as a human being. If you touch fire, your body will recoil from the fire automatically. There's no choice involved. So the basic feature of the mind is that it's attracted to certain things and repulsed by things. And that's a very, very basic desire that all life forms have of moving towards pleasure, moving away from pain. In a simple animal, it just happens autonomically. It happens automatically without you doing anything. There's no conscious thought behind it. You just automatically move towards pleasure and away from pain. As animals become more complex, they begin to feel fear. And that's when you get into these subcortical areas of a modern brain, areas beneath the cortex. And you get into these deeper areas of the brain. And specifically the amygdala and what's sometimes called the limbic system, which then interfaces with the brain stem and sends signals to your body to react in certain ways. But there's a fear thing which happens. And at a certain degree of complexity, animals feel fear. And fear opens up possibilities. Because if you feel afraid, then you can choose what you want to do to respond to that fear. You don't have an automatic response, which may be of limited evolutionary value. It may be of limited value to you for survival. Sometimes it might make sense to lean into your fear, because leaning away from your fear isn't going to help you. For instance, if an animal feels fear and it runs away, then animals, generally speaking, are not very good at defending from their back. There are exceptions to this. Horses can kick very, very strongly with their hind legs. And so, a lot of quadrupeds can do that. But for the most part, animals are less equipped to defend from their back. They're more equipped to defend from their front. And again, there are exceptions, but that's a general rule. And so if you turn your back, or you cower, or you freeze, then you become much easier prey. And so sometimes the animal will feel fear, but it will fight instead of running away. So when to run away and when to fight, that requires there to be space between that fearful feeling and the response to the fear. And so the more complex an organism gets, the more it has feelings like fear, which then allows you to think about what you want to do with that fear. Do you fight? Do you flee? Do you freeze? How do you respond to that fear? You guys have this? But what is really fear? It's repulsion. It's dislike. It's aversion. It's the dvesh. In the rag and dvesh model, attachment and aversion, it's the dvesh. In the sankalpa vikalpa, it's the vikalpa. Those terms get used in a variety of ways, so they're context dependent. But you are correct. That is the feature of the mind. And usually a commentator will then say sankalpa vikalpa means rag and dvesh. In the yoga literature, rag and dvesh are mentioned specifically as part of the kleshas, which then drive the vrittis. So the kleshas underlay the vrittis. And the vrittis are the fluctuations of the mind, and those are underlaid by the kleshas. Rag, dvesh, abhinivesh, the desire to cling to life, attachment, aversion, avidya, ignorance, the granddaddy of them all, and there's one more, which I'm forgetting. It's escaping me at the moment. And so you'll find different descriptions of this, but the basic feature of the mind is it's attracted to and repulsed by things. Now, human beings are the most sophisticated animal. Animals have the same blueprint of a brain, but areas get less developed and more developed. Human beings have this fully developed frontal cortex, and that allows for abstract thinking, where you look at things and you see commonalities between them, and you see threads of continuity, and you're able to look at things. You're able to look at a chair and a table and see how they go together. You're able to look at, multiple items in a given group and notice the thread of continuity which ties all those items together. How trees give fruits and plants give vegetables, and then, cows give milk. And therefore all of these things are food. Animals, of course, will go and view all these things as food, but that abstraction of seeing how everything fits together, that is the activity of the prefrontal cortex, specific to human beings. There's no indication. And the more progressive an animal gets, the more it can think abstractly. We think so abstractly, we think about religion and philosophy and who am I and why am I here? And of course, then there's a downside of it. We can take those fear responses and we hold on to them for an entire lifetime. And we spin out and get neurotic. Whereas an animal, a rat will just feel fear and then make a decision and then move on with life. We'll dwell on that fear for years and decades and think about it and rationalize it and try to ignore that we're feeling fear. Or envy. Envy is another one nobody wants to admit that they feel. And so then we'll rationalize, I don't like that person. Why? Because you're envious of them, because you can't tolerate their eminence and they're better at you than something, and that makes you feel insecure. No, I don't like them because they fill in the blank, because they wear glasses. We find some way to justify to ourselves what may be a very primitive emotion that we can't admit to, and so therefore we sophisticate it, and we get sophistic with it, and we try to rationalize it to then preserve our sense of self, because there are things such as envy, greed, lust, which are unacceptable in today's society, and so you can't admit to feeling those things. And so if somebody does admit to feeling things, you look at them like, ooh, like what's wrong? But imagine if somebody walked up to you and goes, I'm really envious of that person. What would be your reaction if somebody said that to you? Huh? I'm envious because they're really good looking. So I'm envious of them. I hate them because they're better looking than me. You're repulsed by it, right? Right, because you've never experienced envy before. You're just such a liar about your own envy. And it's been taught to you that it's not acceptable to feel envy. And so if somebody was to say to you, I feel envious, you'd be like, get away from me, right? But that says more about you and your comforture with dealing with those emotions and your inability to even acknowledge them, what to speak of deal with them, what to speak of reconcile them. You following this? Philosophers write about envy for like thousands of years. How it's just one thing everybody experiences, but nobody will admit to it. And so we experience these primitive attractions and repulsions, and for most people, what they then do is they sophisticate these very, very primitive feelings and they try to justify them. Like, my daughter was at the laundromat yesterday, and, everybody was chatting her up. And I'm sure if I walked in there and said, hey, why are you guys chatting to my 16-year-old daughter? They'd be like, I was just trying to help her do her laundry, and I talk to everybody who comes in here, and I'm just being friendly, and they would have all sorts of excuses for what they were doing. You follow? Who's going to say, oh yeah, I was making a play? Who's going to admit that to somebody's irate father? They might not even admit it to themselves. You follow what I'm saying? So let me try to make this argument more complete. Please listen. At a certain degree of simplicity, an animal just reacts. They see a shadows a predator coming to eat it, it just moves. At a certain degree of complexity, the animal will feel fear. Now that light sensing collection of cells becomes sophisticated enough where it starts to form into a primitive brain, a simple brain. And then the animal feels fear. And fear allows an animal to choose amidst a variety of responses, some of which may enable it to better survive. It opens doors. Then human beings now have this prefrontal cortex super developed. It's what allows for language. That uniquely human feature of incredibly, infinitely complicated language because of recursion, because we can stack ideas and use words in different ways to add to ideas one on top of another, usually through prepositional phrases. I went to the store with my friend on this day to buy this thing for this party, at this price, at this time, in this city, in this country, in a car, driving on this freeway. You see what I can do? Animals can't do that. These are the two things which distinguish human beings from all other animals. The incredible ability to think abstractly and philosophically about things and notice similarities and themes amongst many disparate items and contemplate the meaning of them and therefore plan into the future and think about thinking and life and big subjects, and simultaneously the ability to communicate that deeper thought to other people in a detailed way. Which, of course, for social mammals has all sorts of values. By being able to communicate, we're able to all stay in touch with each other and survive better and thrive better. But that doesn't mean we don't feel these baser emotions. And what's the basest emotion? Attraction and aversion. And that's what the mind does. And everything that comes afterwards is built on that. And we then sophisticate attraction and repulsion to justify it, to rationalize it. But behind all that, oftentimes is a very animalistic, simple attraction or aversion that's almost precognitive. And then we spend all this mental energy justifying it, rationalizing it, making it look good, making it look clean. Which means that you're not doing the right thing. You're defending your sense of self from looking bad. And so that's what's behind you have this incredible cognitive faculty, which you can think about things in such a deep and profound way. But what do you spend your time doing? Justifying your childish, animalistic impulses. Did you follow that? You take this incredible machine you have, right? And you spend it trying to justify and argue away and not own up to and run away from your animalistic impulses and urges. And so once you've dealt with those things, these manogatan, the things which have come forth from the mind, which have gone forth from the mind, based on attraction and aversion, all that sarva kama, all those various desires that ultimately can just be traced back to attraction and aversion, the most animalistic of impulses. Once you get rid of all those, and atmani eva atmana tushtaha, you find satisfaction in the self by the self. You've realized you're a soul, you're not this body, and you're secure in your sense of self in that, and therefore you're able to let go of these lower desires that generally define people. And you've identified yourself as a spiritual being, and you found satisfaction in that. That's what it means to be self-realized. You've dealt with your lower self. You've understood, admitted to, been honest about your lower self. And that no longer defines you. You don't have to argue away from it. Because it doesn't define you, it doesn't motivate your actions. You step back and you create space. And those petty urges no longer define what you're going to do. You have a higher sense. And what is the higher sense? Your sense of duty and values and integrity. And so you step back from the pushings and pullings of the mind, which makes you no different than an animal. And through contemplation and through depth and through honesty and using this amazing mind that we have, the cognitive faculty we have, which goes so far beyond these simple emotions, and properly using that, we've distanced ourselves from those attraction and repulsion, and we can acknowledge those things for what they are, and they no longer determine our course of action. Rather, our course of action is determined by higher values and higher principles and a higher sense of self. And that's a generic definition of a self-realized soul. That's the basic feature of a self-realized soul. And what's amazing about this basic feature, and we'll finish with this, is you can start working on this today. Now, of course, you have to be a theist here. Satisfaction in the self, by the self, that's not narcissism, because the thing which makes you special, yourself, makes everybody else special as well. And your self-love becomes love for other people, because we're all made out of the same spiritual nature. And so your inward journey into narcissism and self-love becomes it gets externalized, because now by loving yourself, you also realize that what I love about myself, that I'm a spiritual, eternal being, ever connected with the deity, everybody else is that too, and therefore I love everybody else. And now your inward journey becomes an empathetic journey. And of course, that's what happened. I learned how I feel. I learned what it's like to be me. then I can extend that and project it onto you, and now I can imagine what it's like to be you, and I can feel love for others. And so self-love becomes a precursor for love for others. But this version of self-love, loving myself as a soul, becomes tantamount and equivalent to full love for others, because you realize that what makes you special makes everybody else special as well.